Every milestone I reached, my parents found a reason to minimize it. I spent years thinking I was doing success wrong. Turns out I was just doing it without their permission. Posted to r/true off my chest. I got promoted last April. Senior Director, the role I had been working toward for 3 years at 32, which my manager said was the youngest person in the company to hold the title. I called my parents from the parking garage on the way to my car, still in my work clothes, too happy to wait until I got home. My mother said, "Just make sure you don't let it go to your head." My father said, "Big companies chew people up. Don't get too comfortable." I sat in my car for a few minutes before I drove home. I have been sitting with some version of that experience for my entire adult life, and I am finally ready to say what I think it actually was. My name is Priya. I am 33. My parents, Sunita and Vijay, are in their early 60s. They immigrated from India before I was born, built a modest, stable life through work that was harder than anything they have ever described to me directly, and raised me and my younger brother Rohan in a household where achievement was the stated goal, and the achieved goal, and also, somehow, never quite enough. I want to be careful here. I do not want to tell this story as ingratitude. My parents worked for everything. They wanted more for me than they had, and they communicated that consistently. They paid for my education. They showed up. What they struggled to do, and what I have spent several years in therapy and in honest conversation trying to understand, was be proud of me without immediately adding a caveat. Without the qualification that arrived like clockwork on the heels of every good thing I told them. Not congratulations, but congratulations, but. The but was always different. Sometimes practical. Sometimes comparative. Sometimes dressed as wisdom. But it was always there, arriving before the good feeling had fully landed, like someone moving the furniture before you finished walking through the door. Let me give you the specific history because I think the accumulation is what matters. When I got into my first choice university at 17, my mother said, "Good. Now don't waste it." My father said he hoped I had considered the financial implications of the city it was in. They did not say they were proud. When I mentioned this to Rohan years later, he said he remembered that day. He said our parents had gone to their room afterward, and he had pressed his ear to the door and heard my mother crying, but not sad crying, the overwhelmed kind. He said he thought she was proud and didn't know how to show it. I didn't know that for 15 years. When I graduated, top of my department, I got a hug and a dinner at a restaurant of my choice and a conversation over the meal about the uncertainty of the job market and whether I had applied broadly enough. My father's colleague's son had also graduated that year and had gotten a government posting, which was mentioned twice. When I got my first real job, my mother asked if it had good benefits. When I got my second job, better title, 30% salary increase, my father asked if I had negotiated hard enough. When I bought my own apartment at 29, my mother toured it and said the neighborhood seemed noisy and the kitchen was small. Each of these moments is small in isolation. Together they form a pattern, and the pattern took me a long time to name because each individual instance came with a plausible face. Practical concern. Worldly wisdom. The caution of people who had seen things go wrong and wanted to protect me from going wrong in the same ways. I accepted each instance as love in a particular dialect and moved on. What I was slower to name was the cumulative effect of the pattern, which was this. I had learned to pre-minimize my own achievements before telling my parents about them. I had learned to arrive at the conversation already having taken the air out of the good news, already having noted its limitations, already having prepared the qualifier myself so that the qualifier from them would land softer. I had learned to be the first one to say, but so they didn't have to. That is not a small thing. That is a significant reorganization of how a person relates to her own success. The promotion conversation was the one that broke through. Not because it was worse than the others, it wasn't. But because I was 32, and I had been in therapy for 2 years, and I had enough language for what was happening that I couldn't unsee it. I told my therapist, Dr. Kavya Nair, about the call from the parking garage. She asked me what I had expected. I said I had expected to feel celebrated. She asked what I felt instead. I said, like I had brought them something they didn't know what to do with. She said, "What do you think their defensiveness is about?" I said defensiveness. Not concern, not caution, because that was the word she had introduced several sessions earlier and that had kept resonating. Defensiveness. Not pride withheld. Not high standards. Defensiveness. I had been framing my parents' responses as a communication style, a cultural pattern, an expression of love that looked different from the love I wanted. Dr. Nair had been gently and persistently suggesting that something else might also be happening. That a parent who responds to their child's success with immediate qualification might be responding to something the success surfaces in them, not in the child. I said, I think my success makes them feel something complicated. She said, tell me more. I said, I think when I do well, it highlights the gap between what they were able to do and what I am doing. And I think that gap might be hard for them to hold. Because they worked so hard, and what they built was smaller than what I am building, and I don't think they know how to be proud of me without also feeling something about themselves. She said, how does it feel to say that? I said, like I'm criticizing them. Like I'm saying they're not big enough to be happy for me. She said, are you criticizing them? I said, no. I think I'm just describing something real that they have never said out loud and that I have been absorbing for 30 years. She said, those can both be true. I want to say something here that I find difficult to say because it involves naming a dynamic in my parents that I love them too much to name easily. My father left a career in engineering in India that had real promise. The immigration, which was necessary, and which he has never once complained about, required him to rebuild from below the level he had been at. He did it. He made a good life. He is proud of what he built. He is also, I believe, aware of what he did not build, of the ceiling he encountered and accepted and worked within, of the version of himself that existed before the starting over, the one with the trajectory that went somewhere specific. I have his trajectory. Not because of anything particular about me, because I had advantages he did not have, a head start he provided, an education he funded, an English fluency that was native rather than acquired. I have further simply because I started further along. When I succeed, I think my father sees both things at once, his daughter doing well, and the distance between where she is and where he could have been. I think those two things are very difficult to hold simultaneously. I think the just don't get too comfortable was never really about me. My mother's version is different but adjacent. She is a woman of formidable intelligence who went to college in India, who is good at her studies, who came to a country where her degree did not transfer and her accent was a barrier, and her options narrowed significantly from what they would have been had she stayed. She became excellent at other things. She built a home and raised 2 children and managed a household and did volunteer work in our community that people still mention to me when they hear her name. She built a full life. She also, I think, has a clear picture of the life she did not build. And when I build it in front of her brick by brick, promotion by promotion, apartment by apartment, I think it reflects something back at her that she has not fully made peace with. The don't let it go to your head was never really about my head. I had the conversation with my mother in December. Not the conversation I had been planning. I had not planned a conversation exactly. I had been planning to keep absorbing and processing privately, and maybe someday finding the right moment. But the right moment arrived without announcement, the way right moments usually do. We were washing dishes after family dinner. Rohan and his wife had left. My father was in the other room. She was talking about a neighbor whose daughter had gotten into medical school, and there was something in the way she said it, the admiration, uncaveated, genuine, that made something rise in me that I didn't push back down. I said, you talk about her daughter the way you never talk about me. She turned from the sink. I said, every time I tell you something I've achieved, there's always a but. A warning. Something to temper it. And I've been trying to understand it for a long time. I think I do understand it now. But I want you to know what it's felt like. She did not say anything. I said, it has felt like my successes make you uncomfortable. Like they're a problem to manage rather than a thing to celebrate. And I have spent years thinking that was about me, that I was presenting them wrong, or expecting the wrong response, or wanting something unreasonable. And I don't think that anymore. I think it's hard for you to watch me do things that the path you took didn't allow you to do. And I understand that. I genuinely do. But I need you to know that your discomfort has landed on me as disapproval, and it has changed how I relate to my own success, and I want that to change. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't know I was doing that. I said, I know. She said, I am proud of you. I said, I believe you. And I need you to say it without the but. She said, I don't know if I know how. I said, I think you know how. I think it's just hard for different reasons. She put down the dish she was holding. She turned to face me properly. She said, when you got the promotion. When you called from the parking garage. I said, yes. She said, I was so proud I didn't know what to do with it. And the first thing that came out was the warning. Because that's what I had. Because the things I've been afraid of for you are more available to me than the pride. I said, why are you afraid for me? She said, because I know how quickly things can change. Because I have seen things change. Because the women in my life who had things were taken. I stood at the sink with my mother at 62 years old and understood, for the first time, that the warnings were not criticism. They were history. They were the history of a woman who had watched things be taken, who had watched herself be reduced by circumstances she did not choose, who had loved her daughter so completely that she had been afraid for her from the beginning, and who had never found a way to separate the fear from the pride, so they had come out tangled, and the fear had always landed first. I said, Mom, I'm okay. I know things can change. I know nothing is guaranteed. You taught me that by how you lived. I learned it from watching you. But I also need you to let yourself be proud without apologizing for it. She said, I'm proud of you, Priya. No, but. I cried a little. She did too. My father was harder. My father is a man who expresses almost everything through action and almost nothing through direct language. He drove me to the airport at 4 in the morning for an early flight rather than let me take a cab. He reads everything I send him. He calls Rohan to mention things I have told him in a way that tells Rohan, and therefore me, that he has been thinking about them. He does not say the thing. He does the thing instead. I told him what I had told my mother more briefly. I said I had noticed that my good news was often met with caution, and I wanted to understand why. He was quiet for a long time. My father's silences have weight. He said, I don't want you to fail. I said, I know. He said, the higher you go, the more there is to fall. I said, Dad, that is true. And it is also true that you have never once told me you were proud of me without immediately telling me to be careful. He looked at his hands. He said, I am proud of you. I said, I know. Can I tell you something? He said yes. I said, every time you follow the pride with a warning, I hear the warning and lose the pride. The pride disappears behind the warning, and I carry the warning home. And I have been carrying a lot of warnings. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, you should not have been carrying that. I said, no. He said, you are my daughter, and I have watched you work harder than I have ever asked you to work and become more than I was able to become, and I have. He stopped. Started again. I have not always known what to do with that. I said, I know. He said, I am proud of you. That is the whole sentence. That is the whole sentence. I have thought about that phrase every week since he said it. The whole sentence. Not pride plus warning. Not achievement plus caveat. Just the pride ending there complete. Things are different now. Not transformed. I want to resist the word transformed because it implies a permanence I cannot confirm. But different. Lighter. The phone calls have a different quality. When I share something good, there is a beat, a real beat of reception before anything else. My mother says that's wonderful and means it. My father asks questions about the thing, curious questions, the questions of someone who is interested in the answer rather than already prepared with a response. Last month, I told them I was being considered for a board position at a professional organization. My mother said, Priya, that's wonderful. Full stop. No but. I waited for the but. It did not come. I said thank you, and we talked about what the role would involve, and she asked smart questions, and it was just good. It was just good. I called Rohan afterward. I said, "Did that seem different to you, the way they've been lately?" He said, "Yes." "What did you do?" I said, "I told them the truth about what their caution had been doing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should try that." I said, "You should." The thing I want to leave you with is this. Some parents respond to their children's success with defensiveness, not because they do not love them, but because the success surfaces something in them that they have not resolved. A path not taken. A life reduced by circumstance. A fear so habituated it arrives before the love does. If you are waiting for a celebration that keeps arriving as a warning, the conversation is hard, but it is possible. My mother didn't know she was doing it. My father didn't know what to do with his pride. They were not withholding deliberately. They were giving me what they had available, and what they had available had been shaped by everything that happened to them before I existed. Understanding that did not make the years of warnings disappear, but it changed what I do with them. I carry them differently now, not as verdict on my success, as evidence of their history, offered imperfectly through the only channels they had. And underneath all of it, always, pride. It was always there. It just needed someone to say, that is the whole sentence. You can stop there. Edit. Dr. Nair, who started using the word defensiveness and waited for me to find my own way to it. If you ever read this, the parking garage story became the story that changed the conversation with my parents. You were right that it was about them. That was the piece I needed. Edit 2. My father sent me an article last week about a woman in my field who had been named to a national committee. He sent it with a single line. This could be you one day. I read it 3 times. Then I called him. He picked up on the first ring. We talked for 40 minutes about the field and the work and what I want to do in the next 5 years. He asked good questions. He listened to every answer. He did not warn me about anything. It was the best conversation we have ever had. I am still thinking about it.